I'm going to stand if that's all right. I'd just like to thank the organisers for what has been a fantastic conference, truly enjoyable, and also a really wonderful opportunity to meet many of my colleagues at Brown, so I feel very grateful for that as well. Okay, so in 1995, an Irish cardinal, Cahill Daly, stood up before an English congregation and he did something remarkable. He requested forgiveness from the people of this land for the wrongs and hurts inflicted by the Irish people upon the people of this country on many occasions during that shared history, and in particular in the last 25 years. He proceeded to express the belief that reciprocal recognition of the need to forgive and be forgiven was a necessary condition on proper human and indeed political relationships between the two islands in the future. Some years later, in 2017, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, expressed the hope that in apologising to First Nations communities, in acknowledging the past and asking for forgiveness, that, as a country, we will continue to advance on the path of reconciliation together. In 2019, on the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II, Germany's President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, ascended a stage in Warsaw and said, "In no other square in Europe do I find it more difficult to speak. I ask for forgiveness for Germany's historical guilt." And in 2024, the Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, issued an official proclamation asking for forgiveness for the state's role in slavery, saying, "The state of California humbly asks for forgiveness from those affected by past atrocities, both deliberately and negligently." As a potential mechanism of social reconciliation, forgiveness has significant appeal. It presents as a possible alternative or ameliorative to the harshness of retributive justice. It promises radical results. Whatever forgiveness is, it's standardly supposed to be categorical. So you're either forgiven or you're not, but once you are forgiven, magic. It costs little to pursue, in financial terms at least. Obviously, it can be very costly in other respects. But from the standpoint of the state, that has to be an asset as well. And it enjoys a certain sort of moral authority. Years of association to organised religion have left it with a kind of patina of divinity. It's good to forgive. It's generally thought to be very good, morally good. So it's unsurprising that these convenient qualities have not gone unnoticed by leaders of communities grappling with legacies of atrocity and wrongdoing. In what follows, I take it that the conceptual parameters of forgiveness are contingent and contestable, and I argue that we should challenge the commonplace that forgiveness is, as a matter of definition, morally good. Forgiveness is not necessarily good. But accepting that it is, as many of us kind of want to do, given the claim of the commonplace on us, allows it to exercise an outsized normative claim upon us. And in particular, an outsized normative claim upon the ever-growing legions of the wronged. Now, although my focus in this talk will be moral, my argument is motivated by a political concern. Namely, that in contexts of oppression, to celebrate forgiveness as a heightened virtue can function to contribute power to the oppressor and to displace proper goals of justice. While, as Hannah Arendt so perceptibly observed, forgiveness and its analogues may yet free us to utterly new possibilities of political life together, the moralized advocacy of forgiveness has a long and dubious association with political oppression. As a moral expectation, forgiveness is often deployed asymmetrically. We expect it and celebrate it most when it arises from the oppressed, from racialized minorities, from victimized others, from women. From the powerful, we neither expect nor especially esteem forgiveness, although we may obsequiously welcome its elective analogue, pardon. With Fanon, then, I think that we should be wary and observe that moral reparation for national independence does not fool us and it does not feed us. Against totalizing injunctions, like Desmond Tutu's instruction to the people of South Africa that there would be no future without forgiveness, we would do well to note, again with Fanon, the political ideology, the political and ideological utility of concepts like forgiveness to colonial, fascist, and imperial powers, who cynically valorize and advocate their popular adoption in their efforts to discipline, pacify, tame, subdue. In calling into question the moral goodness of forgiveness, we call into question its normative claim upon us as actors. But we need to begin by establishing a kind of working definition. Now, I've said that the parameters of forgiveness are contingent and contestable. In my view, forgiveness is best approached as a kind of heterogeneous cluster concept, as something that denotes a range of distinct but historically and practically interrelated ideas whose relationship is one of family resemblance and genealogy, rather than one of shared necessary and sufficient conditions, which are the things that my colleagues are always looking for. So that's a problem for me as a philosopher. We need a kind of working definition. So I'm going to adopt some constraints, very broadly construed constraints, that find significant support in the philosophical literature on forgiveness. And I'll work on the assumption that forgiveness is a practice with roughly the following broadly sketched features. It's something that arises where there is a wrongdoer and a wronged party. It is undertaken in response to the wrong. It has as its responsible author the wronged party, whose choices conduce to forgiveness. Now, forgiveness need not be a wholly volitional achievement, but nor is it wholly non-volitional on this account. Forgiveness alters the landscape that's wrought by the wrong, bringing about a new state of affairs that is standardly capable of characterization as a positive development for the wrongdoer. And it involves, at least in part, a categorical emotional achievement, the overcoming, elimination, or restraint of at least one of the retributive reactive attitudes. So things like resentment, anger, contempt. Those things are reined in. The things that the wrongdoing is naturally inspired in its victim. Now, having this kind of skeletal form in mind, we may move to ask whether we should follow the popular tendency and add moral goodness to the picture. Should we also, as is so often the case, regard forgiveness as something that is by definition morally good? Now, one obvious possibility that I cannot readily exclude here is that forgiveness is morally good as a matter of fact because a divinity loves it or commands it or requests it of us. That's certainly something that we have precedent for in the intellectual tradition on forgiveness. I'm going to put those kinds of arguments to one side. I'm going to just kind of confine myself to secularized moral intuitions. And I want to kind of critically consider two possibilities for vindicating the goodness of forgiveness that are suggested by the formal features of forgiveness as I've identified it. These aren't possibilities that are exhaustive of the arguments that we could make in favor of the goodness of forgiveness, but they represent a good starting point. And I think that their critical examination will serve at the very least to unseat any comfortable assumption we might have about the general goodness of forgiveness. The first of these potential justifications has to do with the moral value of helping the least well off. And it says, forgiveness is good because it benefits something like the moral pauper, someone who is impoverished, morally speaking. The second justification has to do with the possibility that forgiveness is inherently virtuous. It says, forgiveness is good because it is, as a matter of definition, magnanimous or generous, or plug in some other kind of appealing virtue. But let's start with this idea first, that forgiveness is good because it benefits the moral pauper. The wrongdoer is someone who, having transgressed the norms of society, is in a sorry moral state. By violating the rights of their victim, they have diminished their own moral status. They've sacrificed their expectation of equal moral regard from their victim, and perhaps even from others in society, depending on the severity of their transgression. Now, there's a pronounced tendency in the Western moral tradition to exhibit special moral concern towards those who are socially marginal in various respects. Jesus, whom Hannah Arendt notes was a first-rate moral philosopher, tells us to care especially for the poor, the weak, and the stigmatized other. He also models exceptional care for sinners, going so far as to sacrifice his life for them. So there's some precedent for the intuition, in at least one major moral tradition, that we should care especially for those who are in moral deficit. Derek Parfit, who was, relatively speaking, given the last person invoked, at least a second-rate moral philosopher, also tells us to weigh the welfare of the less well-off more heavily than those who are better off. So perhaps if we bring something like Parfit's moral prioritarian lens to situations involving interpersonal wrongdoing, we can see things as follows. The victim, being blameless in the situation, enjoys a neutral or good moral status, as well as an opportunity in the form of forgiveness to do something morally extraordinary and worthy of even higher status. Whether they forgive or not, the default is that their standing is better than that of the wrongdoer. Now, perhaps if prioritarianism is true for the morally low of status, then due concern for the wrongdoer might motivate an attempt by means of forgiveness to improve their situation. By abstaining from retributive reactive attitudes towards the wrongdoer, the victim abstains from publicly marking their diminished status. Forgiving them presents as something good to do for the familiar reason that it functions to raise up the least well-off. Now, of course, I think this justification might work a bit better if forgiveness did not involve the restraint or diminution of attitudes to wrongdoing that we standardly take to be morally defensible, socially positive, even perhaps required by a spirit of justice. Retributive reactive attitudes like resentment are, as many contemporary authors, but also historical ones like Joseph Butler argue, basically pro-social attitudes. They bring people together in shared disdain of wrongdoing. They unite the community around shared values, and they can establish disincentives for wrongdoing. It's one thing to argue that it's good to favour the least well-off in socioeconomic terms in the distribution of material resources or social opportunities, but it's quite another thing to say that we should exercise disproportionate moral favour to sinners, where the favour consists in alleviating a reaction that aptly expresses disapproval and sanction and communicates that to others in society as well. Whatever forgiveness is, its benefit to the wrongdoer is linked to the mitigation of the victim's retributive attitudes. But there are clearly cases in which these attitudes are appropriate, pro-social, morally instructive. We don't have to go very far to think of examples where the retributive reactive attitudes might be appropriate, morally instructive at the moment. But think of authors of atrocity, like recidivists, concerted rogues, who are not only unworthy of beneficence, but who might even be inappropriately emboldened by it. With cases like these in sight, it cannot be the case that forgiveness is morally good simply because it benefits those who are in the moral deficit. Indeed, an obvious way to start questioning the widely appreciated moral status of forgiveness as good is to note the strangeness of celebrating a practice that involves conferring benefits on wrongdoers. It would be bad, and clearly bad, for example, if we were to normalise and morally venerate a practice of reversing the normal flow of reparations, of paying those who kill our loved ones. It would also be bad if we were to establish norms that push victims to give gifts to those who have wronged them. It's not great, as a matter of societal moral hygiene, to allow these sorts of norms to emerge, because not only do they pervert our expectations of justice, they corrupt our incentives to do and be good. Where we promote a norm of forgiveness by celebrating it as good, we might rightly worry that doing so stands to benefit wrongdoers who, in many cases, as a matter of public morals, simply should not be benefited in this way. Now, perhaps you're not a fan of retributive justice or of maintaining space for the pro-social experience of resentment, or you think that other strategies can productively substitute for practices of sanction without worries of interference from forgiveness. But even if you're skeptical of the moral utility of the retributive reactive attitudes, you might be still moved by recognition of their political usefulness and by the critical role that they play in the fight against oppression. You might also be moved by the thought, again a political one, that celebrating gifts of power or social status from the victimized to their wrongdoers as good, precisely in virtue of the fact that they benefit wrongdoers, is not the right sort of message about social value to transmit if you aim at a just society. Recall Fanon's statement of the ideological utility of forgiveness to colonial powers as they seek to discipline, tame, subdue, and pacify. In such contexts, for a colonial subject to participate in the practice of forgiveness, or indeed in the celebration of forgiveness as good, just can be to contribute power to the oppressor. Now, someone might nonetheless question the practical importance of the negative reactive attitudes in fighting oppression. After all, forgiving doesn't mean that we have to accept a wrong as right or abandon other components of our pursuit of justice. But if forgiving does mean overcoming your natural retributive attitudes, then it seems to me from a standpoint of moral function to impose a pretty significant psychological burden on the oppressed, who must somehow fight for reparations, but without the significant motivational effect of outrage at the oppressor. Indeed, once we consider the needs and interests of the oppressed and the importance of establishing systems of social normativity that buttress rather than undermine the fight for restoration and recognition, the prioritarian lens that we initially trained on the moral pauper arguably reverts its focus to the class of the wronged once more. It's for these sorts of reasons, the moral concern with preserving apt and pro-social affect practices, the political concern with success and solidarity in the fight against oppression, that some philosophers have argued that forgiveness must be conditioned upon wrongdoer repentance or evidence of goodwill. But I have not articulated any such constraint, Because it seems to me that unconditional acts of forgiveness, take the parishioners of Emmanuel Church forgiving Dylan Roof, for example, are legible to most people as acts of forgiveness, and perhaps also most likely to achieve moral celebration. So I think that if we craft a concept that carves these off, then we're kind of doing violence to the lived reality of forgiveness. And the fact that these kinds of cases appeal to us as paradigmatic of forgiveness is suggestive. If we celebrate forgiveness, the more difficult or improbable it appeals, then perhaps what we take to be morally good about it doesn't have to do with the wrongdoer or with the benefit that they receive. Perhaps this is all incidental to the really good thing that forgiveness expresses, namely the moral character of the forgiver. So I think we can abandon the moral pauper thesis and move to more promising terrain. So here we are, the idea that maybe forgiveness is inherently virtuous and expresses something very good about the forgiver. Now, even on the broad sketch of the practice of forgiveness that I've adopted here, it's tempting to surmise that its execution must require the exercise of praiseworthy virtues, like generosity, and that this could in fact be what makes it good. After all, by definition, the forgiver is a victim who chooses to improve the circumstances of the person who has wronged them. Doing something good for someone who has wronged us sounds generous. And note too that the categorical nature of forgiveness kind of conditions this. Once a wrongdoer is forgiven by their victim, that is properly the end of the question of forgiveness for that wrong by that victim. The forgiver is not only conferring a benefit, but giving up an otherwise persistent natural entitlement to feel aggrieved. Somehow, they are able to hold an act against them as wrong, while at once and permanently refraining from the attitudes that such acts naturally inspire. It's no mean feat. So maybe forgiveness is morally good because it involves the exceptional exercise of widely recognized virtues like generosity. But I don't think that can be right. Because forgiveness, as I've defined it, forgiveness that serves to benefit the wrongdoer in some respect and that resolves negative emotions in its enactor, can equally occur without a loving heart or a generous spirit. It might even arise out of vicious motives. So Hobbes and Nietzsche both make their readers sensitive to the possibility that the practice of forgiveness could quite plausibly have emerged in satisfaction of selfish, perverse, and even vindictive urges on the part of human beings. They show us with great psychological acuity how legible acts of forgiveness can be born out of cruel or selfish motivations. In a society that freights forgiveness with certain sorts of positive moral significance, to forgive another can function as a move in a moral game aimed at dominating or humiliating its target. In a related vein, Martha Nussbaum describes how forgiveness may, even often, even standardly on her account, under cultural conditions like ours, be deployed almost vengefully as a move in a game of moral tit for tat, where it functions as a status-focused act of payback. Now, debasing the other could be a functional target of forgiveness, but some acts of forgiveness also clearly serve as a form of self-debasement. So think of the abused partner who repeatedly turns the other cheek and professes forgiveness. This is not something due moral celebration. Clearly, forgiveness is a bit complex in this regard. Finally, note that the mere presence of virtue does not suffice to secure an all things considered goodness for an act of forgiveness. Think of the priest who lovingly forgives a parishioner for having had a child out of wedlock, the mob boss who generously forgives a consigliere for breaking a meta, the conservative restaurant owner who magnanimously forgives a trans woman for using the women's restroom. In each of these cases, the exercise of forgiveness might well involve some form of personal virtue, but it nonetheless violates key moral norms. Now, it may be objected that these are all instances of flawed forgiveness, that true forgiveness must emanate from a loving heart, express self and other respect, aim at true wrongings, and only address morally worthy wrongdoers. Although an appropriately conditioned forgiveness of this nature may yet have bad consequences, it cannot be deemed bad, as proponents might wager, almost as a matter of definition. Now, as I said earlier, I don't think that we're justified in this kind of definitional hedging. Endorsing it requires us to exclude perfectly recognizable and legible acts of forgiveness, perhaps even a preponderance of legible acts of forgiveness, from the class in order to secure the claim of the act to fundamental moral worth. But a different but related conditionalist view of forgiveness skirts the problem of definitional hedging by holding that not all forgiveness is morally good, that only a clearly defined subclass of acts of forgiveness enjoys a moral status, and that some version of the conditions that I just suggested might mark that class. The question is, should we agree with these nuanced conditionalists? Should we agree that there is a defined subclass of acts of forgiveness that are worthy of moral veneration and simply accept that everyone should acknowledge them in a more targeted way moving forward? Acts in this class might not be bad in any of the respects that I've suggested just now, but walling off certain obvious ways of being bad and building in agential virtue to the act may still not suffice to secure the status of moral goodness for such a conditional forgiveness. Imagine a practice that involved the expression of personal virtue, but was nonetheless very bad for the common good of society. Not only was it bad, but it was bad in a particular way. It was bad precisely because it was taken to be morally good, even though its exercise standardly violated accepted moral values. Where this practice was morally celebrated, the expressive effect was then to functionally deny or contradict other values necessary for good social function. Describing this practice as morally positive would have the expressive effect of contradicting values that we want to hold on to, not as a contingent matter, but because saying that the practice is good means by extension that the other values we hold good can't be so. Those who want to celebrate this practice as morally good thereby find themselves in a contradictory stance with respect to other pivotal commitments in the standing system of social and moral normativity. I've already gestured at a tension between forgiveness and norms of retributive justice. But here I want to focus on a different sort of worry, maybe one that's less familiar, although it's also connected to traditional considerations of justice. Saying that forgiveness is good, celebrating it, and morally promoting it as morally positive visits a subtle kind of harm upon the wronged. It is nonetheless the sort of harm that a system of social morality that aims at the good, and in particular at the goal of restoring the victims of wrong, should aim to avoid. I'll begin by saying here that it would be a dubious system of morals that required difficult acts of generosity from the wronged just in virtue of the fact that they had been wronged. Indeed, a system of morality worthy of the name, a system of morality that works for us as the sorts of creatures that we are, should arguably recognize what I term the principle of double victimization. It should avoid, so far as is possible while realizing other core values, placing taxing and potentially harmful burdens upon victims simply in virtue of the fact that they have been victimized. Forgiveness, because it involves overcoming apt reactive attitudes, and will often, maybe even always, require the contribution of both volitional and non-volitional achievements for its success, is psychologically difficult to bring about. Some people, despite willing themselves to forgive, may find themselves incapable of it. Given the variability of emotional disposition, the psychological complexity of the achievement, the principle of double victimization pushes us to reject the notion that there could be an obligation to forgive. But acts needn't be obligatory to be morally good. A supererogatory conception of forgiveness might yet allow victims to forgive without the imposition of a demand. Even if we adopt a supererogatory conception of forgiveness, on which it is good to forgive but not bad not to forgive, it still seems to me that we would make a moral mistake to characterize it as good. Morality should not ask us to impose privileged normative expectations, hopes or dreams of goodness on those who have been wronged just in virtue of the fact that they have been wronged. Now, perhaps you're unmoved by the construal of the option of forgiveness as burdensome. Perhaps you even think it's a benefit to have such an option rather than a burden. After all, where forgiveness is deemed good, restricting the possibility of a certain sort of moral credit to the class of the victimized might seem like a means of redress. Earlier, we focused on the possibility that forgiveness could be good because it uplifts the wrongdoer. But note that doing it also elevates the moral status of the forgiver. So I guess it raises all ships. We dismissed a prioritarian move to care for the sinner. Perhaps deeming forgiveness as good, as supererogatory, can be vindicated nonetheless because the option to forgive itself figures as a sort of moral compensation to the victim for having been wronged. I don't think it's any such thing. Having the option to do something exceptionally good is not necessarily an advantage, as anyone who's ever been faced with the possibility of running into a burning building or intervening in an unjust arrest can tell you. You might think that charity is a supererogatory action and know that it's not burdensome to live in a world where charitable giving is an option, but forgiveness isn't like charitable giving. It's more like running into a burning building. It involves suppressing, controlling, overcoming perfectly apt emotional reactions to wrongdoing, just as running into the building involves suppressing, controlling, or overcoming perfectly apt emotional reactions to fire. Any compensatory justification will struggle to get off the ground, moreover, because an option on moral excellence is just not the sort of advantage that the wronged especially need. If it is a compensation, it's misguided. For a start, the wronged are, at least qua wronged persons, not people who have problem with moral status. That's an issue that's peculiar to perpetrators. Now, perhaps you think, well, forgiveness might yet promise to secure the good of peace of mind, that any psychological cost can be prudentially justified. But there are other practices that can secure the peace of mind without the complex psychological struggle entailed by forgiveness, and which do not, moreover, place the victim in a state of moral risk as well as potential moral benefit. For undertaking forgiveness is risky. It's supposed to be categorical. It's something that we're supposed to persist in. There's no take-backsies. Where we fail, having offered it to someone as a gift, we effectively retract the gift, something that constitutes a new act that might justifiably be viewed as a novel wrong against the wrongdoer. That's not a great situation to be in. It's hard to suppress apt resentment all the time, so the risk is real. My worry is that in carving out a special class of action that only the wronged can perform, and in celebrating it as morally positive, we establish it as part of the normative defaults of victimization, that being victimized now comes with a difficult moral choice, and with the potential for moral costs for those who can't rise to the celebrated occasion, who can't run into the burning building, or who do, but then fall short. Everything becomes weightier, more complicated, harder, and this all strikes me as kind of unjust. We should be focused on restoring the victimized, not making moral heroes or failures of them. If our system of morals valorizes forgiveness, an act that only victims can achieve, an act, moreover, that perpetrators receive at least one distinct form of benefit from, then so much the worse for it as a system of morals. Recall, too, the worry from the last section of this paper, that promoting a norm of forgiveness can function to undermine the fight against oppression. These worries together make forgiveness a morally dubious value to affirm, even if all of its practitioners are morally excellent people. We should not, therefore, say that forgiveness is good, where for constitutional reasons, it stands to compromise key goals of social morality. Thank you.
Thank you so much.